We had at the end of our discussion last time, it sounded like we were just starting to get into the topic, so we thought we needed to talk about it some more. So Sam graciously agreed to come back and give us some more new material, and we have a whole new roster of speakers tomorrow, so really looking forward to it. On the housekeeping stuff, the bathrooms are right there. And we will, this section will go from 7 to 8:30. Sam will talk 45 minutes or so, and then we'll have question and answer, and we'll come around with a microphone to you. And then at 8:30, we'll have, you can come up to Sam and talk, and then we'll have a reception in the back room there with wine and assorted appetizers. So last time we didn't break up until about 10 o'clock in there. So I don't need to say much to introduce Sam Perry. You know who he is. His bio I've handed around. He is a full professor of sociology at the University of Oklahoma. Has written co-authored two books on white Christian nationalism. One of them we have in the back, and I'm sure he'd sign them for you if you wanted him to do that. So I would. The only thing I would add to that would be he's worth following on Twitter. He has an active Twitter feed, and he went to a meeting that Ryan Walters attended in Norman, and Sam got all over him, and still gets all over him a lot. He gets all over Mike Johnson a lot too, the new House Speaker. So I would encourage you to follow Sam's Twitter feed. It's worth it. So I'll let Sam start his talk right away. Please welcome Sam Perry.
Okay. What a privilege to be here. Thank you so much for taking the time to come join us tonight, and thanks for allowing me the opportunity to come and share some research. So I'm a sociologist. I'm trained as a pastor. I have a seminary degree from an evangelical seminary from Dallas Theological Seminary, and I spent several years as a minister. But I'm coming to you tonight in the capacity as a social scientist. What does that mean? That means that I am professionally, in the capacity that I speak as a social scientist, I am obligated to stay near to the data. So I'm not an ethicist, I'm not a philosopher, I'm not a theologian. And though I've worked as a pastor, I'm not coming to you as a pastor. I'm coming to you with somebody who has gathered a lot of data and has analyzed that data, as a social scientist should. And I want to share that research with you to try to help you understand the realities that we're facing. There is a time where sociologists can be involved in questions of ought. Right? Ought this to be this way? Like we can make statements about what is morally right and ethically good, and what is what I think we would all agree on is good governance and the way our society should be organized so that we maximize democracy and liberty for everybody. And yet, as a social scientist, I'm first obligated to understand not just what ought to be, but what is. And so that is what I want to share with you tonight, what is. And the focus of my talk tonight is going to be on Christian nationalism and its relationship to what we are all facing in the country right now is partisan polarization. You may have heard that word before. It's kind of a buzzword. It's been going around for the last few years that we are polarized. What does that mean? I'm going to try to unpack that a little bit and explain what do I mean by polarization? What is Christian nationalism's role in amplifying polarization? And what are some things that we can do tonight and in our own lives to try to mitigate those problems, okay? So first I want to unpack what I mean by Christian nationalism. Now, if you came to the talk the last time we were here, I talked about Christian nationalism as really three things. Christian nationalism can be spoken about in three different registers. First, we can speak about Christian nationalism as a political ideology. A set of beliefs, a set of values that drives people's, say, political behavior and the way they relate to other human beings. So white Christian nationalism, or Christian nationalism, is a political ideology. It's a group of beliefs. It is also increasingly an identity. This is something that is a new development within the last few years. If you get a chance to read our book, The Flag and the Cross, we talk about how Christian nationalist ideology is older than the country itself. It has been around since before we were a nation. Since as early as, say, Anglo-Protestant Americans have been here, they've laid claim to who this country rightfully belongs to, and they have mixed race and nation and religion together. And so white Christian nationalism is as old as the colonies. And yet, this new thing that Americans are now calling themselves, politicians and religious leaders, some of them are now calling themselves Christian nationalists. If you do something, if you want to check out something that technology offers us, go to Google Trends. Google Trends is a little thing that you can do on Google to see what people are searching for these days. And if you go to Google Trends and you type in Christian nationalism, what you're going to see is it'll take you all the way back to 2004, and you can look at how often people are searching for such a term in the United States. It'll go back to 2004, and what you will see if you look at that term is you will see a flat line, meaning nobody is searching for that term, all the way up until around January of 2021, where there's a spike. What happens then? Well, that's the Capitol riots. So we all witnessed that. There's flags, Christian flags and Christian worship songs and a lot of Christian rhetoric and prayers in the Senate chamber. And that is followed, that's a minor spike. What's followed by a big spike in June of July of 2022. And what that was Marjorie Taylor Greene, House Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene, who took to Twitter, recorded a video of herself saying that the Republican Party ought to be the party of Christian nationalism. She did that multiple times. As a matter of fact, she actually campaigned on that slogan. She sold t-shirts that said "Proud Christian Nationalist" with pictures of her with her fists up. If there was any doubt what Christian nationalism means in that context, it was her with the dukes up fighting the godless left with Christian nationalism. So Christian nationalists, there have been people like Marjorie Taylor Greene, who is a House representative. There have also been religious leaders, Christian leaders and authors are increasingly calling themselves Christian nationalists and owning that label. And they see it as sort of a basket of deplorables kind of move. That, okay, if you're going to say this is a thing called Christian nationalism, we're going to own that label, and now we're Christian nationalists. So thank you for giving us that idea. So Christian nationalism is an ideology. It is increasingly an identity, and it is also a political strategy that politicians, savvy politicians, can use to try to activate and mobilize both the ideology and the identity. So if I'm a politician and I know I'm speaking to an audience that might be friendly toward this ideology or identify with this identity, I can use that rhetoric. It doesn't matter if I believe in it. It doesn't matter if I own that label myself. I just know that will make you, that will hit the button, right? Like that will make you angry, that will make you fearful, that will make you think about culture war issues, and it will make you shake your fist and say, I've got to vote for more of this guy. So that is how we have talked about Christian nationalism. But tonight, I'm just going to give you a very broad definition. This is more of an ideological definition so that we can all be on the same page of what I mean when I use that label tonight. I mean basically a belief that America has been and should always be distinctively Christian in its national identity, symbols, and even its laws and policies. I don't go around calling people Christian nationalists. That's something I try to insist on. I don't like that. I don't like doing that. I don't think that's a very helpful way to go about this conversation. We try to measure Christian nationalism as an ideology, but calling somebody a Christian nationalist is like calling somebody a Nazi or a racist or a fascist. It's kind of a conversation stopper, right? So I think it's probably best to talk about Christian nationalism as a spectrum that people can adhere to, agree to, be in the middle on, or reject completely. So here's how we measure Christian nationalism. This is a set of questions that we're using recently in all of our national surveys. So what we do is we ask Americans, how much do you agree with the following statements on a scale from 1 to 5, right? 1 being completely disagree, 5 being strongly agree, and 3 being neutral. Statements like, America has a special place in God's plan, or I consider the founding documents like the Declaration of Independence and the US Constitution to be divinely inspired. If somebody strongly agrees with those statements, it means they think that we have a special relation, as Americans, we have a special relationship with God, that we have a special role to play, that He has divinely inspired our documents, and that He has a special plan for us. The other ones, the federal government should declare the United States a Christian nation. That gets away from what we call the deep story of Christian nationalism to the vision of Christian nationalism. There's a mythological tale about our relationship with God and Christianity, but there is also a vision of what God wants for our country, that we should be declared a Christian nation, that the Bible should be the foundation of our legal system, that Christians have a responsibility to gain control over national institutions like government, education, and the media. And lastly, I consider being a Christian an important aspect of being truly American. That last question gets into identity. that who is a real American? Who is a true American? Well, it's people like me, it's Christians, right? It's people who embrace that identity and call themselves, those are the right kind of Americans, my kind of Americans. So you add all these up together, and what we do is we create a scale so that you can score. If somebody who scores very low on that scale pretty much rejects Christian nationalism. Most Americans are in the middle, right? They're not polarized on this issue. Most Americans are ambivalent on these categories. Why is that? Well, it's because most Americans still identify as Christians. Most Americans think a little bit of religion and politics is fine. It makes us moral. It's a good thing. That they like religious expression, that they don't have strong opinions on it. So most Americans are in the middle. So you've got people on the far left who completely reject anything having to do with this. You've got most Americans who are in the middle on this. And then you've got a small subsample of Americans who are extreme believers. We might call them ambassadors or adherents of Christian nationalism. So why is Christian nationalism a problem? Why do we talk about it like it's this thing that's kind of dangerous? Or at the very least, we suspect is maybe not what it should be, not what an ideology that people should embrace. Well, it's because in all of our studies, and we have done dozens and dozens of studies now with nationally representative data, we have found that Christian nationalist ideology is not just strongly associated with things like racial and ethnic prejudice, anti-democratic values, conspiratorial beliefs, and authoritarian violence, or support for authoritarian violence. It is often the #1 predictor. It is often a more important, a stronger predictor that you hold those kinds of views than your own political ideology, your partisanship, whether you're educated or not, what part of the country that you're in. Owning Christian nationalism and strongly embracing this ideology is often the leading predictor that you hold xenophobic views, that you don't like immigration, that you want to build border walls, that you are Islamophobic, that you're fearful of Muslims, and that should motivate the way we engage in foreign policy with other nations. Anti-democratic values, we have shown in our studies on Christian nationalism, it is one of the leading predictors that you believe it's too easy to vote already in this country, that we should disenfranchise felons for life, that you would support hypothetical civics tests in order to vote, that you believe voting is a privilege and not a right. In other words, it is a privilege that we can take away, that we can limit, rather than a right which shall not be infringed. Conspiratorial beliefs. We've shown Christian nationalism is strongly predictive that you embrace QAnon conspiracy. This idea that the elites, the business elites and the political elites, especially in the Democratic Party, are a part of an elite child sex trafficking ring out of a pizzeria. Like this is something that people really believe in. Christian nationalism is one of the leading predictors that you support this idea that there are something dangerous and deadly about COVID vaccines, that the election was stolen, all of these different factors. And lastly, authoritarian violence. Christian nationalism is a alarmingly strong predictor that you believe that things have gotten so far off track in this country that true American patriots may have to resort to physical violence in order to bring us back. This is troubling, right? Like all of those things together suggest, they point to an ideology that is alarmingly close to the F word, fascism, right? Like and I don't say that lightly, right? Like I think about this a lot. I've read a lot of books on fascism, and I'm careful about making those comparisons, and yet I can draw no other conclusion other than that this points to an underlying ideology that is quite similar to the kinds of things that we've seen in other nations where they were taking over some kind of far-right group that doesn't mind excluding, oppressing, marginalizing, stigmatized groups so that it can have power itself as a minority. Now, what I want to talk about today is, despite the fact that we have found all of these things in dozens of studies that we have done now with nationally representative data, we are now just diving into this idea that Christian nationalism is strongly associated with polarization, right? That we as Americans are polarized, and Christian nationalism plays an important part. But it plays an important part in combination with other factors, and I'm going to explain how that works. First, I want to talk about what polarization is, but first I need to talk about how human beings are, right? So we need to know something about human beings. The first thing I want to show you is that human beings are not only social, but we are groupish. What do I mean by that? Well, I think all of you would recognize that we long to be in relationship with one another, that we long to be in conversation, that we want to be known by people, that want people to know us. We want to be in social relationships. We gravitate towards those kinds of things. It is the rare person who doesn't want any kind of interaction at all. And I'm an introvert, right? Like I have very like little I'm usually in my cave all day long, working on my little papers, and that usually suits me just fine. And yet I still crave those relationships. I get those from my family, I get those online sometimes, I get those from my students. And so those things are important. So we're not just social though, we are groupish. What do I mean by that? I mean, we are tribal. We think about our own identity within a context of other relationships that is built socially and not independently. It is a fiction. It is a fiction that we as human beings can be disconnected in any way from our social context. None of us are raised by wolves, and that's never happened, right? We are not raised in a context where we are just devoid of any kind of social influence, that culture doesn't play a role, that school and parents and our social context doesn't play a powerful role in how we define ourselves and what we value and think and do. And it is often we define our social relationships in comparison or competition with other groups. And so oftentimes we think we naturally group up, is what I mean. Jonathan Haidt, who is a social moral psychologist that I love. It's getting hot in here, so I'm going to take this off. Jonathan Haidt is a moral psychologist that I really love, and I love his work. He's a really important book called The Righteous Mind, Why Good People Are Divided by Politics and Religion, that I'd recommend you look into. But one of the things he says in that book is that human beings are 90% chimp and 10% bee. What does he mean by that? Well, he means that we have this thing that he calls the hive switch, that when we activate our groupish nature, our hive switch, our desire to be a part of a group and to be connected to other people and to define myself within a group, we activate this hive switch and all of a sudden we lose our individuality, we become part of the group. And that especially happens when we think about competition, when we think about values, and we think about the kinds of things that the people that we compare to within this context. So this leads to a distortion of our perception. Most of our cognitive biases, in fact, the ways that we look at evidence and we read something different completely are traced back to our groupish nature, our need to protect our own social identities and our own social groups. Have you ever, I bet you have you ever been in a situation where you have explained the facts to somebody you disagree with, right? Like you've been in maybe even in a little bit of an argument, but let's just say it's been in a discussion where you've explained the situation, you've outlined the facts to the person that you're in discussion with, and by the end of that conversation, they are just as dug in as they ever were, if not more so. That's because oftentimes we don't relate to one another in terms of disagreement, moral disagreement. We don't relate to one another in terms of facts. We relate to one another in terms of our group identities and what we want to preserve and protect. And so you are doing battle with a social identity. You are doing battle with their groupish, hivish, tribalistic way of thinking. And that is hugely problematic when we get into politics and we're trying to figure out what we should do policy-wise and how we should make decisions. So I'm going to teach you a new term today. Are you ready to use a new term? I'll quiz you after this to make sure that we remember. All right. So here's the new term. This term it's called social identity complexity. All right. Now this is a term that's been used in social psychology for decades. It's not a new term, but it is something that has become increasingly relevant to our discussions of politics, and I'll tell you why. Social identity complexity is the degree to which we recognize or don't recognize overlap in our most important in-groups. And so all of us are a part of various groups, right? We're a part of various members. So I am a part of a church. I am an employee at the University of Oklahoma. I live in Norman. I'm an American. I'm white. I'm married. I have all of these different identities. And I recognize that people in my groups, sometimes they overlap and sometimes they don't, right? Social identity complexity is what I focus on in those overlaps. So somebody who has, and I just use the example of race, nation, and religion here. You see that there's overlap. Some people share those identities and all of those identities, and some people don't, right? Where do I focus? People with low social identity complexity, they perceive their in-groups as overlapping and convergent. When they think about their most important in-groups, who are people like me? Who do I identify with? Who are my kind of people? They think right in the middle of those overlaps. They think people who are, in this case, they think people who are the same race, same nation, same religion, all the people who share those identities, even though there are some ways in that they don't overlap, right? Like there's some complexity there. People with high social identity complexity perceive their in-groups as distinct, but cross-cutting. Somebody who has high social identity complexity recognizes that they have overlap in their groups, but there's also diversity, there's complexity, and that's an okay thing. That's okay, that not everybody in my group, the people that I relate to, share the same identity, there's complexity in there, and they recognize and even value the fact that not everybody in their same group agrees on the same topic, shares the same identity, and that is okay. We find that people who live in, say, urban or cosmopolitan contexts have high social identity complexity. Why? Well, because you're around a big population, you're most likely involved in a bunch of different groups, and you really have to have high social identity complexity because you're involved in a lot of relationships with people who may or may not overlap. And those people tend to be pretty tolerant when we try to measure those things. People with low social identity complexity are more likely to live in a social context where, say, that's like highly rural, where most people in your community really do share the same social identity. And what do we expect? Well, we expect people with low social identity complexity, and here's the problem, people with high social identity complexity tend to be more tolerant because they are able to hold differences in tension, and people with lower social identity complexity tend to be more intolerant because they think my people are just like me on these 5 different identities, right? So why is this a problem? Well, it becomes a problem when we really do face a situation where we have extreme overlap in all of our social identities and relationships. And that is what we are leading to in the United States. So the story of American polarization. When you hear we're polarized, I wonder what comes to mind. When I tell my students that we're polarized as a nation, they usually think something like this. They think that we as a country are moving towards extremes on our political issues, that you've got extreme left and you've got extreme right, and the middle is being completely hollowed out. There's no more people in the middle. There's no more moderates. There's no more independents. We're either strong Democrats or strong Republicans or strong liberals, strong conservatives, and the middle is disappearing while we become extreme. That actually isn't the case. So I'm happy to disabuse you of that. That is not the case. Most Americans, it looks more like this. This is the distribution. Even when I ask my students, when I survey my students at the University of Oklahoma, you might think a bunch of like 18 to 22-year-old college students who are educated, you'd think this would be a bunch of lefties. It really isn't. Like when I survey most of my college students, I get a pattern that looks an awful like that. I get a lot of moderates. I get some Republicans, some Democrats, about an equal number, and I get very few strong one or the other, strong Democrats, strong Republicans. Same with ideological identity. I get a lot of moderates. I get a lot of some liberals, some conservatives, very few extremely liberals, extreme conservatives. It looks mostly like this. So what we see is most Americans are still in the middle on most issues, and there are a few people at the extremes. But what has happened in the United States is another kind of polarization that is related to what we call sorting. So there's another term for you. So we've got social identity complexity, but we've also got partisan or political sorting. That is the story of American polarization. So what has happened in the last few decades is this, and hopefully a visual will maybe explain this to you. When I was born in 1980, and around the time that I was born, in the 1970s and 1980s, we were still, according to, as Democrat and Republican were split, our groups were not so clearly distinct, our identities. I'll just give you some examples. And I can show you this statistically. We have data that goes all the way back to the early 1970s in the General Social Survey that you can see about how these percentages have changed over time. So in the Democratic Party, these days, you have a lot of liberals and moderates, and Republicans is mostly conservatives. But about 40 years ago, you had a larger number of moderates and even liberals in the Republican Party, and you had a larger number of moderates and conservatives in the Democratic Party. They weren't so neatly sorted along ideological identity. Take the religious group. I've got evangelical over here. This is something that blows my students away because they've never known anything but this. You might be surprised to know that in the 1970s, you were statistically just as likely to be an evangelical Democrat as you were to be an evangelical Republican. There was no difference and no statistical difference in your likelihood to be one or the other. In other words, if you told me you were an evangelical Christian or Southern Baptist or whatever, I would have no reason to predict that you are a Republican or Democrat on the basis of that identity. I couldn't tell because you had equal numbers in both. That obviously is not the case today, right? Like we know that is not the case, right? The Republican Party is 40% white evangelical and 80% white Christian. They have changed those over time and they have sorted. So you've got urban and rural, which is a far more rigid divide. This is strongly rejecting Christian nationalism, strongly supporting it. We were more combined. You had the identities that overlapped in a lot of important ways. What has happened in the last 4 decades is this. You ready to watch? That's what's going on. We are sorted, right? So over time, these identities that used to overlap in party, and party didn't really tell us much about all of those identities, now it tells us everything about those identities because we are neatly sorted along partisan lines. The Republican Party is increasingly, more so than the Democrats have gone leftward. The Republican Party has moved rightward faster than the Democratic Party has moved leftward. The Democratic Party is still filled with liberals and moderates. Moderates make up almost the same percentage of the Democratic Party as liberals. Republicans have moved to isolate, become almost completely conservative now, and very few moderates and liberals. The Republican Party has become increasingly disproportionately white. They're not increasingly white in that sense because the United States is becoming more racially diverse. Both Republicans and Democrats are becoming more racially diverse. But the Republican Party has become disproportionately white. They do not match. In other words, they don't match the diversity of the country as a whole, whereas the Democratic Party has actually outpaced the rest of the country in terms of its racial diversity. So the Democratic Party is increasingly racially diverse, disproportionately so. The Republican Party is disproportionately evangelical, whereas the Democratic Party is made up primarily of secular Americans or non-evangelical, non-white evangelicals. So you've got Black Protestants and liberal mainliners, and you've got Latino Catholics, and you've got minority religious groups who make up the Democratic Party. It's a diverse coalition there. Rural and urban strongly support Christian nationalism, strongly reject it. Even our consumption patterns tell us about that. What kind of beer you drink, whether or not you go to Target, right? If you drive a pickup or a Prius, I know, right, what kind of party you likely vote for because our consumption patterns now tell us so much, more than they ever have before in our past. So what has happened is that we really have converged in our social identities along partisan lines. And the problem with that is this. As a society, we are essentially funneling everyone now into social identity complexity and increasing intergroup intolerance. We have taken a situation in which we had diverse and overlapping social relationships that did not align with partisan identity so strongly. And now you tell me you're a Republican, or you now tell me you're a Democrat, and it feels like I can predict successfully 6 other identities and groups that you belong to. And so the Venn diagram that I showed you is merging to become a circle to where all of those people really are the same. And as we develop low social identity complexity, because the people that we know in our in-group really are all alike on all of these identities, we start to become more intolerant towards one another, towards outsiders, toward out-groups. So that is a problem. And that's a problem for people of faith, right? Why is it a problem for people of faith? Well, what happens when Christian becomes synonymous with Republican or conservative or Donald Trump, as it has become within the last few years? Well, we can actually show, we see this over the last 2 decades in particular, that young people, especially if they have any kind of left-leaning views, as young people often do, they are increasingly deciding on their religious identity on the basis of their political identity. And so they are saying that if that's what it means to be a Christian, count me out, right? If that's what it means to be religious, I would rather be nothing. I would rather be secular. And does it mean that they don't believe anything about Jesus? Does it mean that they don't pray? No. Oftentimes they're spiritual. Oftentimes they want those kinds of things. They want to pray. They want to engage in those kinds of religious practices. And yet, if me saying that I'm a Christian now communicates to you that I'm a right-wing Republican or that I'm some kind of Trump supporter, you've got a lot of young people who are saying no thanks. And in fact, you have the opposite going on in religious circles. We have data, we have evidence. Pew has shown this, and several other data sets have shown this as well, that Republicans are now embracing religious identities when they don't necessarily feel tied to them religiously. So for example, white Americans between 2015 and 2020, Pew found, they had increasingly started to identify as white evangelical. Well, that's weird. I mean, they expected people would run from that label. As that became associated with Trump, the researchers at Pew expected that people would call themselves white evangelicals because they felt like that term would be stigmatized, but they found white Americans were increasingly likely to identify as evangelical. But when they looked at the data and they said, well, who actually is changing their identity there? They found it's not because people were attending church more or had some conversion experience. It was just Trump supporters. In other words, it was people who previously were not evangelical, but they supported Trump in 2016, and they learned that this is what evangelical means. It means pro-religion Trump supporter, right? Like it means that. So what is happening as our identities are sorting and we are polarizing along those partisan ideas is if you vote Democrat, if you have any kind of left-leaning views, you're increasingly pressured or you feel like I must go with the stream to sort. I must become either secular, I must disengage from this group, I must separate and focus on people who are like me and share my political values and identities. And if you are on the right, if you are a Christian or who is a Republican, or if you're a Republican at all, you feel like you need to embrace some kind of identity that is consistent with that, and that is increasingly like evangelical or conservative Christian. People are continuing to sort. And so Christianity becomes filled with right-wingers. Moderate or progressive Americans learn Christianity isn't a place for them. That's hugely problematic, right? For if you are the kind of person who values their faith. I'm a Christian, so I value my faith. I want people to know that what I believe in comes sincerely, and I think that my life and my family has been benefited by my own faith commitments. But to the extent that that communicates something about me politically, I find that deeply problematic, because it really should communicate more about kind of values that I hold as a neighbor, or the kind of life choices that I make as a follower of Jesus, rather than who I vote for or the party that I always vote for, and never deviate from that, right? That becomes a problem. So if sorting is the problem, if sorting is forcing us into this situation where we are deeply polarized, we increasingly distrust, don't like, and really don't even understand each other anymore, right? Have you ever encountered that feeling? Have you ever felt that? Like you've talked to somebody politically, have you heard something that somebody posted, or a video that you've just watched a politician say, and you say, I don't understand you. I don't understand the people who would support such a thing, and what they're thinking, what's going through their brains. We're increasingly encountering that situation where we're no longer able to understand one another. If that is the problem, and it is due to sorting. This is Liliana Mason, who's a brilliant political scientist whose work is changing the game in this area of partisan sorting. If the problem is increasingly overlapping group memberships that amplify partisan hostility, then the solution, as she identifies, is what we call cross pressures. All right, so I've introduced another term. We've got social identity complexity, we've got sorting, and we've got cross pressures. So I want you to remember that. So this is, if the problem is sorting, extreme sorting, that's leading us to be intolerant of one another, then the solution is what she calls cross pressures. And cross pressures are cross-cutting group memberships that suppress partisan hostility. We can see in survey data that people who are cross-pressured, in other words, they have overlapping relationships with people who are not necessarily consistently partisan in that sense. In other words, you've got evangelical Christians who are also voting Democrat, or you've got Republicans who are also religiously unaffiliated. Those are the least polarized people, whereas the most polarized people are the people who are neatly and tightly sorted along all of the consistent identities. So I'm going to show you how this works with Christian nationalism. So we gathered some data in the summer of 2021, and we asked a battery of Christian nationalism questions. And so what I'm going to show you is I'm going to show you how I divided up these Christian nationalism questions into groups, and how that plays a part in combination with other identities to lead to greater polarization. So here's what I'm going to show you. So what I've done here is I've got along the axis over here, this is called the y-axis. Along the y-axis, what we have is a feeling thermometer score. So the way we do this in political science and sociology, the way we measure polarization, how polarized people are, and this is what we call affective polarization. It's about feelings, what you feel towards your party versus the other party. So what we do is we give Americans a survey and we ask them to rate from 0 to 100 their own party and the other party. And what we do is we combine those together and we look at the difference between what you said about your enemy, your opposition party, and what you said about your own party. And the bigger the difference is, that's more polarization. So people who score a 0 on this are people who are not polarized at all. It's basically people who rated so it's like if you rated your party a 50 and you rated the Democrats or Republicans a 50, that means you're not polarized, right? So you think the same about both. Most Americans average about a 50, like on this, like they average like 50%, meaning that they rated their own party at like a 75 and the other party at like a 25. Somebody who scores 100 on this, that's pretty polarized. That means they rated the other group a 0 and they rated their own group 100. Does that make sense? You follow me so far? Okay, so here's what I'm showing. I'm showing the distance between how people rate their own and the other party. That's called polarization, or it's how we measure it. All right, so what do we see? I've divided our Christian nationalism scale into 4 groups based on scores. Over here on the far left, you've got what I'd call political secularists, that they reject completely any mingling of church and state. That they don't want prayer in public schools, they don't want religious symbols in public spaces, they want complete church-state separation, they want all of these things. We call them extreme political secularists. A little bit closer, you've got people who are separationists on the other side, right? So no, this isn't on the other side, but these are people who lean towards more separation. We call them separationists. Accommodators, people who accommodate Christian nationalism, they're kind of warm to it, kind of friendly. And over here, you've got strong adherents to Christian nationalism. These are the true believers. So you follow me so far? Okay, so this is Christian nationalism these days. Now, what I've done is I've combined those with partisanship, strong Democrat all the way to strong Republican. What I want to point out, who are the most, so what do we learn about Christian nationalism first? First this. So consistently, people who are strong adherents to Christian nationalism, look across partisanship, they are consistently more polarized. Right? Like Christian nationalism has some kind of important relationship with polarization that is not explained by other factors. So in other words, like holding tightly to Christian nationalism, I think in general, leads to people being consistently polarized and not liking other people. But what do we also see? We see this works in combination with other identities. This is a sorting story. This is about identity stacking, not just Christian nationalism, but Christian nationalism in combination with other identities. So look at these. Who are the most polarized people in the country? Well, you've got political secularists who are strong Democrats, and you've got strong adherents who are strong Republicans. So what does that mean? It combines the two. So if you completely reject Christian nationalism, you're a political secularist, you want no church and state relationship, you want no prayer in public schools, you want no religious symbols, you think it's something that, and these are people who usually are pretty secular in their own lives, you combine that with strong partisanship. You are a strong Democrat, right? You tend to be a pretty polarized person. You do not think much about the opposition, right? You're a polarized person. On the other side, if you are a strong Republican who strongly embraces Christian nationalist ideology, you believe the nation is for people who are like us religiously, and you want to pass laws to support such a thing, then you are also polarized. So the most polarized people are not necessarily the Christian nationalists, but they are the people who combine strong views on Christian nationalism or rejecting it, political secularists or Christian nationalists, with strong partisanship. It's the combination. How does this work with ideological identity? Same thing. Look at this. Oh yeah, sorry, I don't want to point this out. The least polarized people along partisans. Political secularists who are Republicans. In other words, there's cross pressures there, right? They combine the disparate identities that you usually don't see go together. Who are the least polarized Democrats? Well, it's strong Democrats who are also strong adherents. Now, I'm not saying that you should be a strong adherent to Christian nationalism. I'm saying, isn't it interesting that the most polarized people are the people who combine these strong partisan identities with strong views on Christian nationalism, and the least polarized people are the ones that we see cross pressures with. Same thing with ideological identity. Very liberal all the way to very conservative over here, and this is the same categories. Who are the most polarized Americans? Well, it's the people who are strongly liberal political secularists, that they don't think much of the other party. They dislike and distrust the other party versus how much they like their own. And it's the strong adherents who are very conservative. It's the strong Christian nationalists who are also right-wing in that sense, right? They combine. Who are the least polarized people? It's the political secularists who are very conservative, and it is the strong adherents who are very liberal, cross pressures. This is what I'm saying. So emerging evidence shows, this is why this is important. Christian nationalism does seem to increase polarization on its own, because I believe Christian nationalism is fundamentally about us versus them. It's an us versus them ideology. It's an ideology that says the nation rightfully belongs to people like us, people who share our views and values, and we want to institutionalize its supremacy in society. I think it's fundamentally polarizing, but its effects are amplified by sorting. Supporting Christian nationalism combined with strong Republican partisanship or strong conservative identity produces greater polarization. On the other side, rejecting Christian nationalism, the strong political secularism combined with strong democratic partisanship or strong liberal identity. And when there are cross pressures, there is little affective polarization. So the people who are the least polarized, the people who don't have strong feelings of animosity toward the opposing party, are the people that we see cross pressures in. Now, I've just given you an example. This is just one example among many. Oftentimes we see this among other groups as well. If we, again, I think if you see relatively secular Americans who are Republican, or if you see evangelicals who vote Democrat, you see an example of cross pressure in that these people tend to be less sorted. They tend to be more open. They tend to be more tolerant of political outgroups versus their own. So the implications of this, Christian nationalist rhetoric and ideology matter for understanding partisan polarization. But the relationship is about the combination of strong group identities versus cross pressures. So the questions that we have at hand, and I want us to consider these tonight, we're going to talk about this in the Q&A, I hope, is how can we maintain cross pressures in our own lives? And how can we encourage cross pressures in our society? So here I want to disclose to you how I'm doing this in my own life. I am somebody who I believe in the power of tribal identities, or this kind of sports psychology that goes into identifying with a group. And once I identify with that group, I just want that group to win, right? Like I support that group right or wrong. It's the way sports works. That's how it works, right? Like I identify with a team and I just like that team. And I think the best of the coaches, and I just love those coaches. They're just good guys. And I think the players on my team are good guys. And the opponents that play us, or our rivals, our crosstown rivals, or our rivals in the conference, I hate those guys, right? I think their fans are a bunch of degenerates, and their coach is probably cheating, and the refs are probably in the bag for them. I bet somebody paid them off, right? Like we actually have studies. We have multiple studies that show like sports psychology, like we are naturally more likely, once we start to group up and once we start to identify with teams, we're more likely to accuse the refs of cheating, hate the other team, be biased in our own kind of vision of like what happened on the playing field, all of that stuff. I'm very conscious of that in my own life. So politically, I identify, I'm an independent. I do that, and it's not because I don't have a political opinion, especially about the way things are going in Oklahoma right now. Like I don't find much to like about where the Republican Party is going in the state or at the national level. And yet I am concerned that if I identify with a party, that violates something that I want to hold to as a social scientist, as somebody who wants to be as objective as possible. I don't want to identify with those groups and start rooting for groups, right or wrong. And so I try to reserve that identity. I don't want to identify that way. Here's something else I do, and this goes to the idea of cross pressures. So this may surprise, Don talked about following me on Twitter. You may, if you do follow me on Twitter, you may be surprised to know that I am a longtime member here in Norman. Since I've lived in Norman, I'm a longtime member of a loosely affiliated Southern Baptist church in Norman, Oklahoma. That's mostly college students, and the pastors are my age, but it is loosely affiliated with the SBC. And I not only am involved in that church, I occasionally preach at that church, and I lead a community group with my wife on Sunday evenings at that church, and I lead a Bible study with men on Tuesday mornings at that church. And these are people in my community, and I don't think I agree with them on anything politically, right? Like I can't think of very many people, honestly, in that church that I know of, and this is including people in my community group, that we see eye to eye on all of those issues. But I love those people, and they love me. And when they see me, they don't see some kind of partisan demon that hates them or that wants to shake his fist at them. They just see Sam, they see Jill, they see my kids, right? When my wife got sick with cancer several years ago, those were the people who brought us food, and they ministered to us. And when they have been sick with cancer, we have brought them food and watched their kids and ministered to them, right? We have relationships that are deeper than our partisan identities or the kinds of political views that we share. Those are cross pressures in my life, right? I don't want to have enemies. I don't want to have enemies. I don't want to hate people, and I don't want them to hate me. It is toxic. It is toxic, right? It seeps into our veins. It is in our society. It is killing us. It is eliminating our ability to accomplish anything politically, right? I really believe that this is like, I think Christian nationalism is deeply problematic. It is a problem, right? And yet, something that is, if not equally problematic, is the fact that we are following a stream. And it is a stream, it is a current that moves us towards increasing sorting. right? Like that we find the people who are most like us in terms of these core identities, and we just hang out with them and we listen to them, and we don't understand, like, or know anybody like us, anybody unlike us anymore. And I want to resist that. I want to encourage you to resist that in some way. Find some way to resist that sorting. That may look like for you is doing what I do, which is committing to be a part of a faith community in which you have profound disagreements with people on political issues, but you love those people and you know those people and you're not ready to give up those relationships. I'm not saying go set yourself up for abuse, right? Like go set yourself up to be yelled at, like or go into that place and pick fights every time that you walk in the door. I'm saying no. I want to be a part of relationships where, like, hobbies that we share, values that we share, and that we genuinely just love those people. And when I do that, I can't hate those people, and they can't hate me. And we actually see that we have common values that we share with one another, that we love our kids, that we just want government to work, that we want all of those things locally to happen in our community that we would love to see. And so I want to encourage you, find ways in your own life to resist that endless pattern of sorting that we're facing now. And let's find ways that we can encourage that in society, right? Like that we would actually learn how to talk to one another in some more effective ways. Okay, I'll end with that. And I look forward to any questions that you may have. Thank you.
Thanks, Sam. Well, let me follow up with you on a couple of those things.
Sure.
Is that Bruce Prescott's church?
Bruce, no, this is Providence Road. That's
okay.
in Norman.
Okay. Are you one of the, are there other progressives in the church? Or are you one of the only progressives in the church?
Oh, probably. Yeah, I think there's not a lot of them. There's not a lot of out people in the church, but I think there are people who are moderates in the middle of the road. It's a lot of college kids, so they tend to be a little bit more progressive just by virtue of having godless sociology professors to teach them.
I mean, other than being in a church that has some diversity in it,
yep.
What are other ways that you see to resist sorting?
Yeah, so I think if I were speaking to my own faith community right now, and so this isn't necessarily the challenge that y'all face here, but if I were speaking to, let's imagine that I'm speaking to people who find themselves on the left side of the ideological spectrum and people on the right side. If I were speaking to the people in my church who are primarily on the right side of the ideological spectrum, and I don't think they're all like radical Trumpers or anything like that, but I think they probably identify as like Christian overlaps with Republican and conservative. We have a lot of people who are abandoning the public schools, and because they have bought into fears that have been propagated about critical race theory or whatever they think will happen. And as a spouse of a wife who is a public school teacher, I am deeply hurt and insulted and really offended by that kind of insinuation that that's what goes on in public schools all the time, or that teachers have some kind of agenda to indoctrinate kids along these kinds of ideological things. It's nonsense, right? But I want to encourage my people in my church, like, this is where you meet people. This is where you know people. I meet so many different people at my public school, my elementary school in Norman, which is right around OU. It's at McKinley Elementary, and my daughter goes to a middle school in Norman. It's public middle school, and she is a Christian. She goes to all of these youth groups. I mean, we identify as Christian. We raise our kids as Christians, and yet they have relationships with people who are so different, right? And so we have relationships with our kids' soccer teams and our just relationships there. So public school has been a great way for us to resist that sorting. We could go to like classical Christian schools or home schools or do all those things, but it's something that we have intentionally made a decision. On the left side of the spectrum, in Oklahoma, you don't have much of a choice. I mean, so it's a little bit unfair to expect that from you, because I would wager that most people who embrace any kind of progressive values in Oklahoma, just by the very nature of living here, probably have relationships with a lot of people who are not in agreement with you, a lot of family members, a lot of people in your neighborhood. Certainly, if you go to church here, a lot of people, in your church. But I would say to people like my mother-in-law, whom I love, she hasn't been in church in a long, long time. Strong Democrat, strong progressive values, and she is fed up and disgusted with a lot of what she saw in the church. She was raised in the church and just left. And I would love for her to go back, not because I feel like that saves her soul or whatever, like it's between her and Jesus, but I do think it is a way that she can understand people who are different from her. So if you are in the situation where you feel like, hey, I'm so fed up with religion, I'm so fed up with church, I've been a part of this community and I just don't get it anymore, I don't want any part of that. Consider ways in which you could. It is an opportunity for you to engage people who are different from you, who may embrace different values. Within a context where they're expected to like you and you're expected to like them, that's a good thing, right? Like that's a good thing. And hopefully that's what happens. Again, I'm not telling you to go into the building and just get beat down. Right? Like I don't want you to find a place where you're just going to get into fights all the time. But I think it is important for us to think about like not backing away from those relationships just because that's not the most comfortable place for me. I have found in thinking about this and thinking about resisting cross pressures and thinking about this, I have found renewed interest in leaning into my church. It's been helpful for me. It's been helpful because I have a renewed vision for saying, this is why I want to continue coming to this place. This is why, not just because like I value the faith commitments, but because these people are leading me to understand people I wouldn't normally understand, and wouldn't have occasion to otherwise. So yeah.
So what role does social media have on sorting?
So
let me
yeah.
relate
So
just
bad.
a personal experience.
Sure.
I mean, I'm a pastor. I try to emphasize unity and reconciliation and all that. On Facebook, I probably have 50 friends that I went to high school with. I went to Enid, and 45 of them are staunch conservatives, and try to talk to them and try to have civil conversations. And once in a while you can have one and then might maybe agree on something. And then the next time something comes up, you're a screaming hypocrite.
Right.
And I have not had good experiences on social media.
Yeah. No, so I think social media, we have to be careful about what our role is on social media. I have a platform on social media, and so I use social media to get the word out about stuff I study or findings that I have. And so I've taken a particular role on social media. And yet, if somebody were to reach out to somebody in my community, somebody who goes to church with me, and all of my pastors follow me on social media, and they don't post about those things, we don't get into arguments, I would immediately, if I post something, and I do post opinions, I drag Ryan Walters every day on social media, and I get a kick out of it. I do. And here's and while you bring that up, I think this is important to like, when I'm telling you to relate to people who are different from you, I think there is a limit to the kind of folks that are available for persuasion and willing to have conversations with you on that, and that does not include grifters. It does not include people who really have no belief in anything and are not willing to change their idea no matter what. I mean, it goes back to, and Ryan Walters is probably an example of that. I don't consider Ryan Walters an ideologue. I consider him a grifter who uses really extremist rhetoric to try to radicalize and distract people from policy failures of the Republican Party in Oklahoma because of like public education. When you don't want to fix a problem with policy, what you have to do is you have to distract, and you have to point to wokeness and indoctrination and porn in your schools. Look at what we're doing to do this over here, whereas like we're still 49th in public education because we're not doing anything over here. So that would be an example of somebody that, I think I'll paraphrase Upton Sinclair here, that it is really hard to get somebody to understand something that their paycheck depends on them not understanding. And so Ryan Walters would be an example of that. I don't know if, in other words, I don't think Ryan and I are ever going to be friends. And if he ever reads the stuff I post about him on Twitter or to him on Twitter, we will definitely not be friends. But that does not mean all of the people that vote for Ryan or voted for Ryan or support some of the things that he's doing. I want to know those people. I want to build relationships with them. I do have relationships with them. So going back to social media. So I have built a platform communicating things on social media about the things that I research and what are the things that I think are important. But if any of my personal relationships reached out and said, hey, I don't understand that, and I personally feel targeted by that, immediately my mind shifts to, okay, this relationship is more important than anything I just posted on social media, so how can we have a conversation? And I would communicate to that person. And this has happened occasionally with an in-law or with a friend. And I would say, like, here's what I meant by that. Let's you and I have a conversation about what I meant by that, because I don't want you to feel like I think that about you, or I don't want you to feel like I am angry at you, and I don't want you to be angry at me. And so, like, let's work on our relationship together versus having this heated fight. I think social media is a good place for expressing your identity. I think that is a good thing. That's basically what it's for. Social media is for saying, these are the things that believe, these are the views that I have. I don't think social media is a good platform, especially not Twitter. It's not a good platform for working stuff out in debate with one another. It doesn't allow for context. It doesn't allow for personal touch. It doesn't allow for enough nuance to be able to share your views. And so I would resist the urge to do politics on social media in a way that you think is productive. A great book, and I'm full of like book recommendations, is one I'm going through right now. This is by Eitan Hersh. And it is a great book. I think you'll really like it. It's a good Audible as well, and I love Audibles. It's just 2 hours a day on Audible. So this book is by Eitan Hersh, and this is called Politics is for Power. Let me pull up the full title here. Politics is for Power, How to Move Beyond Political Hobbyism, Take Action, and Make Real Change. So what he argues, he's a political scientist at Tufts University, and he argues that most of us, when we're engaging in politics on social media, we're engaged in this kind of like fake political hobbyism. That in other words, we're telling ourselves we're engaged, we're like catching up on the news, we're involved in politics, we're learning, we're persuading. We're not doing any of that stuff. We're basically just kind of entertaining ourselves by using politics as like sports. And I think he's exactly right there. What real politics is what we're doing right now. It is, I swear it is. What real politics is when we have conversations with human beings, and I'm shaking hands with people, and I'm communicating, and we're meeting folks, and they're able to see me and I'm able to see them, and we can actually get somewhere that way. Real politics is going door to door. Real politics is trying to persuade people in conversation. Real politics is actually trying to move the wheels of power and votes so that things actually happen rather than just yelling at people on social media. So to answer your question, I would not use social media as a way to discuss politics with people. I would use it as a way to do what it's for, which is expressing your identity but I would value relationship above all those things. Did you have a question?
Yes, thanks for your presentation.
Sure.
I'm thinking of the strong group, not strong group identities, but the cross pressures.
Yes.
Insofar as that begins to be a kind of solution that we engage in, it seems to me that longs for a kind of future that rhymes at least with MLK's March on Washington speech.
Yeah, well said. Yeah.
Right? In terms of, this is.
That's Joe Best for our speaker tomorrow morning.
Oh, wonderful. Okay, great.
Yeah, no, I look forward to our conversations, but this is, it's quite intriguing to me in the way in which you've laid this out. And I think that kind of a vision is implied, at least, in what you're suggesting.
Right. I think my goal is ultimately not a situation where we all believe the same things or agree. We'll never do that. That's okay. Yeah. But politics is about some level of compromise, some level of working together. Ideally, in an ideal situation, and this is actually, in what I've explained to you tonight is actually straight from James Madison. It's not from me. So like Federalist 10, Federalist 51, James Madison acknowledges that we are going to have competing factions or groups. We're going to have different groups that we're involved with in our country. And he actually says the more groups that we're involved with, the better, because we're going to have these cross pressures. We're going to have these competing groups, and you're not going to have this really tight alignment between one party where they're all alike and another party where they're all alike and they just hate each other. No, what you're supposed to have is you're supposed to have all of these different group memberships, and that holds division in check, right? So that is his idea in Federalist 10, right? So he talks about this ability of all of these different groups that we're involved with. So it is the original idea of Madison that the savior, not the savior, I don't mean that in a religious way, I just mean like the thing that saves our republic, our democracy from barreling into partisan infighting where they hate each other, we can't do anything, is our ability to maintain these different relationships and the diversity and to disagree well, right? In a non-toxic, healthy way. That also requires something that we need to do this as well. This is something we need to do. But I ended last time our conversation here with the charge. We also need to put this on politicians as well. They need to know that we do not appreciate this kind of rhetoric. This is not what I vote for. This is not what I applaud. This is not something that I appreciate. I want people to turn down the volume. I want people to talk policy, not culture war and difference that just preys upon fear and anger rather than, hey, why can't I just get my sidewalk fixed? That's what I want, right? Like I just want to know if you're going to build that pool in Norman, right? Like, are you going to build that thing, right? Like, I just want to know those things. This is also kind of connected to one of the things that have been such a toxic like development in our American politics situation right now is what they call the nationalization of all politics. So all of our, if you hadn't noticed, all of our politics has become nationalized to where if you are running for school board in Norman, Oklahoma, and you come knocking on my door, for some reason you need to tell me about where you stand on the Biden-Pelosi agenda, right? I don't need to know that because I just want to know, like if you're running for city council, I don't care what you think about Biden or the Democrat or all those kinds of things. But for some reason, we feel like now I need to know what you think about that, right? Like, what does it mean? Well, it means I need to know what tribe you're a part of. I need to know whether I like you or don't like you. I don't want to think about the policies that you're proposing because that's hard, that's complicated. I just need to know whether you're a good guy or a bad guy, right? And that is the nationalization of politics. We take even local level politics and we say, where does this stack with, say, like Republican leadership in Washington, D.C. versus Democratic leadership in Washington, D.C., rather than what it should be, which is local politics should be so disconnected from those kinds of deep partisan fights, because I really just want government to work at the local level. And that also helps us. When we become like local politically, we're also able to collaborate and correspond and work with people who are different from us, rather than nationalizing everything. Yes?
Is the nationalizing because we've lost our local journalism?
Oh, that's part of it, right? So like we have done several things. It's due to several things. Yes, so there's a media environment that nationalizes all this to where politics is for entertainment now. I mean, I really do. So I mean that. Like when we get on social media and we're engaging in these, we follow the news. We are doing something that entertains us for that time being. It's mindless. I'm scrolling through. I'm looking at various things, and the algorithm knows that, and it's just showing things that I respond to and click on. And so I'm entertaining myself with politics, and usually that is some kind of a national politics that I follow, like sports fandom. And I start to develop the same kind of identities. I don't like that politician the same way I don't like Tom Brady, right? Like as a football player. Like I think about it in those terms. So the news environment up to get us to think in those terms, to relate it that way. We don't have local journalism that talks about, that's boring stuff, like local things in the Norman Transcript or the Oklahoman, that kind of media stuff is not as sexy. It's not as click-worthy. It's not as emotionally gripping as stuff that I know that is happening at the national level. So it's part of that. It's part of that. It's also due to other things, like we as secularism in the United States has increased, like we as a country has been more secularized, people are less likely to identify with religious groups and those kinds of things. If there is a downside to that, one of the downsides is that we are replacing that with something. And as we replace our religious identities, that used to unify us in some ways, we're replacing that with ideological identities and political identities. And so the more that happens, that I'm less a Christian and more a Republican, I'm less a Christian and more conservative, and those two things are overlapping in the same, then I start to really I start to nationalize all of that because that's my religion now. Does that make sense? Yeah. All right. Yes. Oh, sorry, I didn't know who. Did you have somebody that you were pointing to?
Sam?
Yeah.
Let Sam take the microphone.
Okay, sure, of course.
If I could just ask two quick questions. Would you think that Jimmy Carter, being a Southern Baptist, was someone who experienced cross pressures and that was his demise?
Oh, that's a good
that
question.
ended his presidency.
Yeah, so, did you have a second question? I didn't want to cut you off.
It's separate, yeah.
Oh, a separate one, okay. So No, Jimmy Carter was, I think, a victim of several different things. I think Jimmy Carter was a victim of the Southern strategy that had, by that time, effectively gripped white evangelicals in the South, and Reagan was able to capitalize in that way with rhetoric that wooed evangelicals away from Jimmy Carter, who were disappointed that Jimmy Carter didn't come out in favor of things like really strong anti-abortion or anti-welfare kind of stances. So it wasn't necessarily being cross-pressured, but it was more he got outflanked by Republicans to get the religious vote. Yeah.
Okay, so the second one is associated. Is every major issue that America will experience, like masking, be taken as a way to polarize ourselves? Is every single issue that we experience going to be used as a way to separate and sort ourselves from now on? I mean,
it seems to be that way, doesn't it? So the most obvious examples would be COVID,
right?
and most recently even Israel Palestine, right? So there is this. I don't know if you've experienced that, but there is this enormous pressure immediately after this tragedy happens, and all of this conflict that's very complicated historically, and it's difficult to get accurate news on, rather than wait so that we can get accurate news about Israel, Gaza, and what's going on there. It's far easier just to say, what are Republicans doing? What are Democrats doing? And I'm just going to buy that. So, I guess we're going for Palestine now, or I guess we're going for Israel. And it's just it communicates something about your core group. So the answer is, I am afraid that is a pattern that seems pretty clear now, that anything, even things that we would be so, like COVID is this asteroid that was headed for the planet. And rather than unify and put aside our petty differences in order to overcome this thing that's going to kill us, and is killing all of these people, we immediately tribed up and we just said, like, oh, the conservatives are the ones who don't mask and they don't shelter in place and they hate all these things. They're not even going to get vaccines. And the Democrats are the ones who want to do all of those things. And we just made it this political deal. It's a scandal. It's how atrocious that was for us. So my answer, yes, I think that has become pretty clear, sadly.
Thank you.
Yeah. But it doesn't have to be. So so let's end with some good news there. What I'm talking about is a situation in which it no longer has to be that way, because we recognize that the people in our community are all dealing with this, and we know people, and we can have conversations about why this really isn't a partisan thing. And wouldn't it be great if our media system, if our media environment was no longer able to score big ratings by just putting pundits up there from 7 to 9 every night to yell into the camera and to talk about gotcha kind of things about how this politician said this, and we did a deep dive into these things and what they're such big hypocrites and don't we hate them? And wouldn't it be wonderful if we just had something else that entertained us besides politics as sport anymore? And I just don't think it's been a good thing.
When you lead the Bible study,
Yes.
how difficult do you find it or do you find it difficult at times to separate the scriptures from politics?
Not with these particular men. I mean a men's Bible study on Tuesday. Is that the one I mentioned? So we're going through a book that talks about work in the life of a Christian. So I've got several students in my group who are like law students at OU. They got another gentleman that I've been in a group with for a long time who's an optometrist, and I'm a sociology professor, and another person who works for Parks and Rec in Oklahoma City. And so we just talk about what the Bible says about work and various things about work. So it doesn't really venture into, and doesn't have to venture into politics. And I mean, they know where I stand on all those things, so it wouldn't be, if they want to go toe to toe with the sociologist who studies these things for a living, they can if they want to, but even then I would try to be as kid gloves as possible, so that we can preserve that relationship.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, sure. In other words, not all my conversations end in politics at all. Yeah.
As the population becomes more urban, as the family farms are closing, people move to the cities.
Yep.
And your theory seems to go with the polarization of the state, Oklahoma is considered a rural state.
Mhm.
And the other southern states considered rural states. Can you project changes that will occur as the population shifts based on your research?
Right. Yes, I think, well, so there's good news scenario and bad news scenario. So the good news scenario, and this is the way that we would expect this to go just given demographic trends, is that we become more diverse as a society. We become more suburban and urbanized, that people interact with one another in ways that allow prejudices to drop. This is ideally the way it's supposed to work, is that's hope. That's hope, so that we end up interacting with people who are not like us, and that we're able to resolve differences in a constructive way. And here's how politics is supposed to work in an ideal society. This is how it's supposed to work. And this leads me to the bad case scenario. So how politics is supposed to work is you get your butt kicked in an election, and you go back to the drawing board and you say, you know what, whatever we were selling that last election, people were not buying. And so our base is obviously changing, our electorate is changing, and we need to change our platform so that we can attract a changing populace, right? That was the conclusion of the Republicans in 2012 after Romney loses to Obama. They have an autopsy. That's the way they call it. They call it the autopsy, the Republican autopsy, where they go back and they release this report and they say, here's what we did wrong. And here's what we need to change. And in that report, they say we need to acknowledge that we're becoming more diverse as a nation, and the Republican Party needs to change to welcome that diversity. Well, some smart, electoral wonk for the Republican Party said, actually, we just need a few thousand more votes in these swing states, and we don't have to change anything. So what they did is they said, we're not going to do that. We're going to lean hard into xenophobia, Islamophobia, us versus them kind of rhetoric. And they were able to score some strategic victories, lose the popular vote, but score strategic victories in that kind of situation. So here's the best case scenario: is as our society becomes more diverse, parties have to change their rhetoric to be able to appeal to a broader electorate. The Republicans as well as the Democrats have to acknowledge diversity, and they have to put out platforms that people will say, yes, you have my interests involved. But what if I don't want to do that? As say a Republican, I don't want to deal with that diversity because my base happens to hate diversity, and they see it as threatening and compromising for them. Well, then what you have to do is you have to subvert democracy. You have to where you no longer have to worry about losing popular elections. How do you do that? Well, you do that by changing election laws. You do that by making it more difficult to vote. You do that by rigging. You do that by lifetime securing justices that have lifetime appointments where you don't have to win elections anymore. In other words, you have to find ways, strategic ways, to make sure that your declining population no longer hurts you in a democracy, right? So that's the scary scenario, is that as demography changes, as our population changes, politicians can get very creative and desperate to say, we don't want to change, and so how do we deal with that? Well, we're going to do these things to try to make sure that we never have to be punished on the basis of, say, losing popular elections anymore. Oh, eventually it becomes impossible? Well, so again, good case scenario is there is a tipping point, right? Like that there is a point at which even the most authoritarian kind of like arrangements and parties have to say, well, we can't do this anymore. We have to recruit other people. And that has historically happened. For example, this is, I identify as a white man, and most people who have ever met me would say, yes, you're a white guy. I've never had anybody accuse me of being anything different than a white guy, right? But people who are Irish and Italian in the United States have not always been white, right? When they came over in the 1800s, they were not white. They were not considered Anglo-Protestant. They weren't of the white race. That is something that has changed over time as the boundaries of whiteness have changed and become more permeable in some ways. Now, we see a situation in which, say, white Latinos who can pass for white in some ways are also given the privilege of honorary white status. So what does that mean, where I'm going with that? So what I mean by that is, even groups that have traditionally tried to hold on to power and the privileges that are associated with a particular ethnic or racial identity will sometimes make strategic concessions to allow certain groups to have those privileges. So the boundaries of whiteness, for example, change over time, and they have often changed strategically to allow certain groups so that they can make sure that they maximize access and voting privileges and those kinds of things. So best case scenario is that politicians recognize the demography is changing. They actually have to change their policies in order to cater to a more broad electorate. Worst case scenario is really do have some kind of authoritarian situation, what we call a Herrenvolk autocracy, where you really do prohibit minority groups in some ways from being able to vote, have access to the levers of democracy in some way. That sounds unthinkable in the United States until you realize we've done that for a long, long time anyway. So it's not unthinkable. We've done that for most of our nation's history. It seems unthinkable now because you'd think we're past that, but how desperate can people get?
Have we been in this kind of a mess before in our history?
Sure. Yeah. Not since the post-civil rights movement, like not post-civil rights. I mean, we have had segregation, we've had legal segregation, we have Jim Crow, we've had all kinds of horrible laws that the government supported, endorsed. We've had overt racism, but we have in many ways in the United States, our racial tensions, our ethnic tensions, our inter-party tensions have become so intense. We have come full circle in some ways to where things that would have been really unthinkable to say in 2012 as a presidential candidate, as a politician, are now things that you can just say, right? Like that you can accuse people of, that you can say on the air. We have moved, if you've ever heard of reference to what's called the Overton window, have anybody ever heard that, the Overton window? So the Overton window is a phrase that it's, yes, so what is acceptable language to use in politics? So the Overton window is the window of what is now acceptable to say in politics. And so you've got people on the far right who will say out loud that they are trying to shift the Overton window, that they are trying to say outrageous things so that maybe they get punished for it, maybe they get called for it, but tomorrow somebody's going to be able to say that same thing and it's not going to be so outrageous. It's just going to be what people say. They've shifted the Overton window. And so what has happened, Trump is an example of somebody who has massively shifted the Overton window to where things that would have been unspeakable by a political candidate or anybody in public a couple of years ago are now just a lot more common, right? Like it's just overtly racist, overtly anti-Semitic, homophobic, and in all kinds of ways. So have we been in this kind of mess before as a country? Sure. Post-civil rights, not as much, right? Like it is something that we have not faced in my lifetime, really.
About overcoming the sorting.
Yeah. I think the fact that within the last month, I have traveled all over the country and I've spoken to a lot of different groups. I've spoken at Denver Theological Seminary, which is an evangelical seminary, and I spoke to pastors and seminary students and professors at that seminary. I flew from Denver that weekend to go speak at the Freedom From Religion Foundation, which is a secular group, and this was in Madison, Wisconsin. And it was almost the same talk given to both groups because both of them are very concerned about Christian nationalism and how that is deeply problematic. The following week, I spoke at a large gathering of Seventh-day Adventists in Chattanooga, Tennessee. Seventh-day Adventists are a fascinating group, by the way. Like they are very conservative theologically and culturally, very devout Christians, very into prophecy, and yet they're very concerned about religious liberty issues and very concerned about Christian nationalism. Then the following weekend, I spoke at a large United Methodist church in Tulsa. There's a very progressive group of people who's also deeply concerned about Christian nationalism. Today, I spoke at the Cleveland County Democrats of Norman to a large group of people in attendance there. And tonight, I'm speaking at a Christian church to a bunch of different people. And so I have been able to speak all over the country to a variety of different people across the political and religious spectrum. And I am encouraged that a lot of people, not just far left, strongly sorted Democrats, are concerned about this. A lot of people are concerned about the kinds of things that I'm talking about. I'm encouraged by that. I'm encouraged by that, the fact that a lot of people are concerned about this. And I plan to speak to all of them, right? Like I will engage all of those people that I can to say what it's going to take is cooperation. It's going to take us putting aside our differences because we share these common values of love and democracy. And so that is encouraging me now.
Got about 5 more minutes, if time for another question or two. Joe,
Yes.
wait for the microphone.
Bell-shaped curve that was up earlier.
Yep.
I had some thoughts about that. There was, you had, that one.
Yep.
That one. I didn't see gender on there. How does gender?
Yeah, gender actually plays it is not just gender, but it is also like marital status that seems to be increasingly sorted. So if I showed you how the 2020 midterms went according to gender, you might not see a lot of difference until you look at gender plus singleness versus married. So the Democrats had a great, as far as midterms go, in an election where they hold office at the national level, usually you see a massive sweep. It's just a bloodbath for whoever's the in-party group during midterms. And you can see this over time, like for decades and decades and decades. Those in the House and the Senate, if your president is in office, you get massacred in the midterms. That didn't happen in 2022, but the only reason that didn't happen is because of single women. Single women went 37% in favor of the Democratic Party in 2022. And married women, married men, and single men all went Republican. And so the only reason that didn't happen was single women who were upset because of Roe v. Wade. That's right. So it's not hard to read that, right? That is a pretty clear one, that after the fall of Roe in the summer of 2022, single women were saying, nope, I'm not having it. So if we look at gender, there's not a huge divide there. There's maybe a little bit more, 55-45 men to women in like more likely, men are more likely to be Republican than women. But the big divide is also gender plus marital status.
Do you see within evangelicals a geographic split? Are there still more liberal evangelicals in, say, the North as opposed to?
Sure. Yeah, that's true. But I would say increasingly, like I went to a church when I went to the University of Chicago, where I went to graduate school. We went to a church in Hyde Park, which is the most diverse church I've ever been to in my life. This was a conservative PCA evangelical church. It was the only church that was accessible in Hyde Park. It's one of the reasons it was so diverse. And so the elders at my conservative evangelical PCA church voted for Obama twice, and they would scratch their heads like, how could anybody do anything different, right? This really is a very regional thing. But I will say the emerging difference is not north-south anymore, it's rural-urban. So in other words, like a Christian in South Chicago has more in common with a Christian in urban Atlanta than the rural person in Illinois has with that Christian in Chicago. Does that make sense? So I would say if you're looking at a map, the big differences are rural urban now rather than like north south. Yeah.
In terms of the sorting, the things that you mentioned to counter it seemed very individual, like things that you're doing.
Right.
And I was just kind of trying to think about things that would encourage people on a more like organizational matter. I mean, like I just read about some program where after they graduate, students spend 1 week with somebody in another part of the country.
I love
that's
that.
very different.
Right.
And I was just like, it just seems to me 1 week is hardly anything, but it seemed like it sounded like it had a lot of effect in terms of desorting.
Right.
And I was just wondering if you've thought of the kinds of things that churches or other groups are governments or whatever might
Yeah,
do?
yeah, I think churches, I mean, at the individual, I mean, not at the individual level, I think churches can participate in ecumenical participation, get involved in community activities. Honestly, though, and this is one of the discouraging things about just the way Oklahoma politics is right now, Ryan Walters in particular, but also just kind of red state politics, is the school choice initiative is a sorting machine. Like that's its point. Like the whole point is to make sure that my constituents who don't want to interact with people who are different from them, and they don't want their kids to interact with people who are different from them. I don't want Johnny or Susie to encounter somebody who has two dads or two moms. I don't want them to perish the thought that they would hear about some kind of racial kind of history that I don't like or that discourages me, or that they would hear something about like gay people being human beings. So what do? Well, you make sure that, because what happens when they do meet that person? Oh, they're human beings? Oh, I don't hate them. Oh, well, maybe they deserve rights too, right? Like that's exactly what happens. We call it the Aunt Susan principle, right? So you may disagree with gay marriage, but you love your Aunt Susan, and then you end up like being okay with gay marriage because you love your Aunt Susan. That's the idea, right? So what happens when you give people unlimited options to just sort themselves out and to go to a homeschool co-op or to go to some kind of Christian thing and you pay for all of it and to make sure? You are feeding a sorting machine, and it is strategic. It is making sure that those values never change. It is making sure that there is no progression in terms of how those people, and you're actually feeding into the very dynamics that I've talked about with sorting, and you're going to make sure that those people are scared and angry, and I think any denial of that thing is unjust and wokeness and whatever. Meanwhile, the public education fails because people with any kind of resources or access, they go somewhere else or whatever. So in a perfect world, I would eliminate a lot of that school choice kind of stuff. Not because I don't want kids to get great education. I do. It's because that the whole point of that is to make sure that those families who don't want to interact with people who are different from them don't get a chance or don't have to. And I think that's deeply problematic and toxic. Yep.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I'm also just wondering about things that churches or other groups can do to counter that from happening. I mean, like, I mean, you mentioned community projects. That's really different than the kinds of relationships that you're talking about in terms of what you've developed with your church.
Right.
And so it's just something I'm kind of going over in my mind.
Yeah. I mean, I would love to hear more examples of that as well, because I think this is something that I have not. This is something that I am behind personally, and I want us to look into more. But it's going to be different by context and what churches can do. Yeah.
Let's. If you have any other questions, you can bring them up to Sam individually. Thank you, Sam.
Thank you. Thank you.
And we'll also have a reception in the back with wine and appetizers, and Sam will have a line of people up here talking to him. So we'll stay until the last person's ready to leave.
Great. Thanks so much for your time.